Hello GCSE students, welcome back to part 2 of the Cold War, where we'll be looking at 1958 to 1970 today. Very similar format to the first video where we looked at Key Topic 1. Again, aiming for that grade 9. I've made importance questions plans for the whole of the Key Topic 2 as well as Key Topic 1. In the comments you'll be able to see the Google Doc, which contains the plans for each of them. And it's a similar story to the first one, where we're going to, a little bit less of exam techniques. The first one I did an introduction in exam techniques, so this video will be quite a bit shorter than Key Topic 1. It's also shorter than Key Topic 1 because of the amount of content that the exam board want you to cover in Key Topic 2. Key Topic 1 is looking from the years 1941 up until 1958. Excuse me. And with that, there are a lot of different kind of smaller things you have to know about. Well, with Key Topic 2, there's 3 areas you've got to know about. You've got to know about the Berlin crisis with the building of the Berlin Wall in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So that's the first area of Key Topic 2. The second area is Cuba, with the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis. And then the third area is Czechoslovakia in 1968. So Key Topic 2, it focuses on, as it says there, Cold War crises. 3 different ones that we look at. Which are there. So we're going to start with Berlin. Actually, before we start with Berlin, what's the best way of revising this part? I talked about Key Topic 1 about doing a timeline. That could work for this one as well, because these are those 3 different crises that we look at. One good way to do this could be each one to look at causes, events, and consequences. And it could even be that you make a big mind map, spider diagram, about each one as we go through. In terms of who are the presidents and who are the leaders of the Soviet Union during the period of Key Topic 2, we're going to see it's Dwight Eisenhower, which you could add onto your timeline from 53 up to 61. JFK from 61 to 63, he's assassinated in 63 and he's replaced by his vice president Lyndon B. Johnson. And then we have Nikita Khrushchev. He's removed from his position and he's replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. The main ones for this, though, with Berlin, it's Eisenhower and Kennedy. With Berlin, it's just Khrushchev. With Cuba, it's Eisenhower and Kennedy and just Khrushchev. And then with Czechoslovakia, we really look at it from the point of view of Brezhnev and the Soviet Union. We don't really mention Lyndon B. Johnson, the US president, for that one. So let's get started with the first crisis then. So thinking back to Key Topic 1 and the Potsdam Conference, if you remember, Germany was divided into 4 zones, 4 zones of occupation: US, French, British, Soviet. And what we saw is 4 years later, if you remember, this is one of the causes of the Berlin crisis from Key Topic 1, which took place between 1948 to 49. We saw the Berlin blockade, and as a result of that, we saw the Germany formally divided into East Germany, which is over here, which is a satellite state influenced by the Soviet Union, and West Germany, okay, FRG, Federal Republic of Germany, GDR, German Democratic Republic, if you want their full names. But yeah, West Germany and East Germany we'll refer them to. Importantly with this, and I think this map shows it the best, you can see that West Germany is here, which is a capitalist country. Also, a little part of West Germany is within East Germany. You could think of it as like a little island, really. Okay, you can see it there. And that's going to be really important for the Berlin crisis that we looked at in Key Topic 1. If you remember, Stalin blocked off the land routes in 1948 to 49. But in Key Topic 2, it's looking at it from a slightly different viewpoint, but still looking at the same area. So, in Key Topic 2 with Berlin, and I always say to students, don't get them mixed up. It's really easy to get them mixed up because both of them are about Berlin, but you could get asked a question about the Berlin crisis from 48 to 49. And if you start writing about the Berlin Wall in there, you're not going to be rewarded for any of the marks. So it's important that you understand the difference between them. So this crisis is more in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So from Key Topic 1, if you watched my previous video, you'd have seen that the capitalist countries of Western Europe got Marshall Plan aid from the United States of America. Okay, and as a result of that, West Germany becomes prosperous. They start getting, the people of West Germany end up having a higher standard of living than the people in East Germany. Okay, what does a higher standard of living look like? Better housing, better jobs, better, like, more availability of things like consumer goods as well. So generally, what we saw was, and this isn't to say that everybody in East Germany was miserable and everybody in West Germany was really happy, but one way of judging whether or not people in a country are happy or not is, do they want to stay in that country and live there? Because what was happening with East and West Germany was there was a refugee problem. Okay, and this is the first part of the specification you need to know about for Key Topic 2. Refugee problem in Berlin. The refugee problem were the people leaving East Germany to go to West Germany. It was easy for the East German authorities to close this border that went from East to West Germany over here. However, the issue they had was that people could just take a bus or a tram or a train, or even just walk over from East Berlin into West Germany. They could either live there, or they could actually fly out into West Germany, the main part of West Germany. So this was a real problem for Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union leader, because it was a country in the world where people had a choice between, do they want to live in a communist country, East Germany, or do they want to live in a capitalist country, West Germany? And essentially what was happening was millions were leaving. Okay, and it's just a good stat there to remember when I spoke about aiming for grade 9, remembering statistics, by 1958, 3 million East Germans had actually crossed over from East to West. Mainly, these are people looking for better jobs, and what we can call it is the brain drain, because these people leaving, they weren't people that were in their 60s or 70s that were on pensions. These were people that are very important for an economy: engineers, doctors. I might throw teachers in there as well. They were people that are very important for the economy, and if you think their workforce, they're going to provide work in labour, which is going to help the economy also as well. They're going to be paying taxation as well on that. These people were leaving. They were crossing from east to west. So what Khrushchev did is, and he said he saw it as a propaganda disaster. He didn't want Western Berlin to be part of West Germany. One reason being because of this issue with people leaving from East Germany to go to West Germany. The second issue being that there were NATO troops based in Western Berlin. Okay, so it meant like within the Iron Curtain. Remember the Iron Curtain from Winston Churchill's speech? Within the Iron Curtain, there were NATO troops that were based within there. So Khrushchev, this is the second part of the specification, which I'll go back to here. Khrushchev set out his Berlin ultimatum. And what it was is he said how he wanted the whole of Berlin to become part of the surrounding territory. And he said, and with it, he said that he wanted Berlin to be demilitarized, meaning that NATO, US troops should withdraw from there. Okay, and an ultimatum is where you say, well, do this or else. And essentially, what Khrushchev was saying is, do this or else. War could be on the cards in the future. So how did the West view it? When we talk about the West here, we're talking about USA, Britain. They saw it as outrageous. They thought that it was another example of the Soviet Union trying to spread communism, like they'd done after World War II in Eastern Europe between 1945 to 1947. But from Khrushchev's point of view, it was important for him to stop those skilled citizens leaving East Germany. And both sides, by 1958, they didn't want to go to war over Berlin. So what we see is we see a series of talks held to solve the Berlin problem, because neither side could agree on Berlin. And this had been a common thing from the end of World War II, hadn't it? Neither side could decide what should happen with Berlin. And with this, the stakes of warfare had changed as well. Like we looked at in Key Topic 1, the arms race. Well, if USA and the Soviet Union went to war over Berlin, it could lead to nuclear war, and neither side wanted that. So they meet in, and this is the next part of the specification, 4 different summit meetings between 1959 to 61. These summit meetings, I always get students to think about this. Like, think about summit, the top of a mountain. These are like the top leaders that meet. That's why we call these summit meetings. And there's 4 of them that you need to know about. Well, I would say, do we need to know about all 4 of them? The first one, Geneva, no agreement is actually reached, and Eisenhower invites Khrushchev to the USA. So it might be an exam. You wouldn't write about that one. But the later ones are important. So Khrushchev, he goes in September '59 to Camp David, which is in USA. It's a bit like a presidential retreat, really. It's in the countryside. There's like a golf course nearby, I'm pretty sure, as well. And whilst he was there, Khrushchev, he went bowling. He was also pictured eating a hot dog as well. Quite American things. But relations at this point were improving, and actually, the Soviet Union, which Khrushchev's the leader of, they agreed to withdraw the Berlin Ultimatum. However, when we go to our third summit meeting, which is Paris, so it's Geneva, Camp David, Paris, and then Vienna's the final one. When we get to Paris, there is a serious crisis that comes just before it. Okay, so one key feature of the Cold War, which I spoke about in the introduction of the first Key Topic 1 video, is like espionage, spying. And what the United States had is they had these spy planes, which they would have thought that the Soviet Union radar wouldn't have been able to pick up because they'd be flying at a really high altitude. Well, anyway, there was this US spy plane that was flying over the Soviet Union. And if you think they're going to be going over, taking images of like missile sites, you can tell a lot about a country from what you can see going on from the air. Anyway, the Soviet Union, much to the annoyance of the United States, they actually shot down the plane. They didn't recognize where the plane was. They thought it could be one that could potentially be dropping bombs. And the pilot, Gary Powers, when it landed, I think he would have parachuted out. There's the wreckage of it there. Gary Powers, not long after, admitted that he was actually an American spy. And I think later on, not sure how many years later, there was some kind of prisoner exchange where Soviet prisoners in America were exchanged for Gary Powers for his return. But the United States, they didn't apologise. And what they did is they claimed that, there's Eisenhower, the president at the bottom here, they claimed it was a weather plane that had actually blown off course. Refused to apologise. This increased tension in a big way. So what was on the agenda for the Paris meeting was having like a test ban treaty, like thinking about, because they know the devastating impact that nuclear weapons and testing them will have on the on our globe, releasing radioactive matter, things like that. They also were going to discuss Cuba and Berlin. Those were things that were going to be discussed. However, because of what happened with the spy plane, the Paris summit ends in failure. And actually, out of the 4 summits that I mentioned before, you've got Geneva, Camp David, Paris, and Vienna. Paris is the most important one to know about because it ends in tension, it ends in failure. There's no test ban treaty. America lied about the weather plane, and they couldn't come to an agreement on Berlin or Cuba. And then by 1961, we have a new US president, John F. Kennedy. He's 2 years president. He was 4 because he was assassinated in 1963 in Texas. And Khrushchev saw a new, relatively young as well, US president in Kennedy and inexperienced, and he thought he could get the better of him. Also, the Vienna one was in the backdrop of the Bay of Pigs failure, which we're going to look at in the second crisis from this key topic 2. So what Khrushchev does is he actually decides to renew that Berlin Ultimatum of 1958, the one where he asked, I say asked is putting it lightly, the one where he really demanded that Berlin should be demilitarized and Western troops withdrawn. There was also the Berlin Ultimatum, which isn't on there, that he wanted it to become like a free city, separate from the rest of it, and to solve the refugee problem. Okay, and what happened after the Vienna? So tension was increased after Paris, the third summit. After Vienna, tension increased again. And one way of seeing tension increasing is how much they're spending on the armed forces. And we see Kennedy, the US president, increases spending on the American armed forces by $2 billion a year after Vienna. And there's tensions growing between East and West. I always get students to imagine you're in East Germany, you're in your 30s, or you've thought about moving over to the West. There's this tension over Berlin. You're not quite sure what's going to happen. You might think, well, right, this is my time to go. This is my time to cross over before the border could be shut. although probably they didn't predict the Berlin Wall would be built. But yeah, in one day in August of 1961, 40,000 East Germans crossed to the west, which is that's a huge amount of people. It's similar to a sort of a good-sized Premier League football stadium worth of people. So what happens? The East German leader, who's called Walter Ulbricht, he wanted the border shut, and he urged Khrushchev to close it. And this shows us the relationship between because East Germany was a satellite state, wasn't it? It shows us that relationship between the satellite states and the Soviet Union. The fact that it was the decision to build the Berlin Wall was going to come from Moscow and from the Soviet Union. So what ends up happening? The Berlin Wall gets built, 12th of August 1961. It starts off as a barbed wire fence around the western section of Berlin. Okay, so if we look at the map, I can get that bigger here. The barbed wire fence, which it started off as, went around the western section of Berlin. So it meant that that border was shut. This border from east to west was shut. They were shutting that border as well. And the wall, it started off as a barbed wire fence. It ends up being more like two walls. There are parts of it where it's like a canal, and you might have one wall on one side, but it ends up being like two walls with like a death strip in the middle. And you can see there some of the features of the Berlin Wall and how it worked, how they stopped people from crossing. With the crossings, and it's very unlikely you're going to write about the escape attempts, which are interesting. But as I said this in Key Topic 1, the course really focuses on the relationship between USA and the Soviet Union because it's called superpower relations. But a lot of the escape attempts happened quite early on after it was built, because by the late 70s and into the 1980s, it was so difficult to cross that escape attempts were quite rare. So it was 27 miles. That's a stat you could remember. So they cut through streets and buildings, separated families, and in the immediate short term consequences, like just following the Berlin Wall being built, there was actually a standoff between American and Soviet tanks. So if you ever get a chance to go to Berlin, there were different checkpoints for where people could actually cross over. And so if you were from West Germany, from West Berlin, you could get a visa and you could cross over into East Berlin and then go back. So there were these checkpoints named after the phonetic alphabet. So there's Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. It's checkpoint Charlie. That is the most significant one. This is one where there was actually a military standoff after the wall was built, where Soviet and US troops were facing each other, and it looked like war. So their direct military confrontation could be on the cards. Okay, we'll come back to that more in a little bit. So, what's the impact of the wall being built on USA and the Soviet Union? And we look at it through history, and it's seen as being a real disaster for humanity, isn't it? The fact a wall has to be built. So and we see it stops for East Germany and Soviet Union. Though there were positives, it stopped the refugees leaving. So in that sense, it worked. It kind of sent a message as well to those in Berlin that communism would not survive. And what ends up happening is West Berlin becomes an emblem of freedom and defiance against communism. And we'll see in a minute. I'll talk about JFK's, John F. Kennedy, who's the US president, his visit there in 1963. Here we are. Yeah. So JFK, he visits Berlin in 1963, and he makes a famous speech. He says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," like I am a Berliner, essentially saying to them, like, I am with you, I'm one of you, and obviously US President Kennedy wasn't happy about it being built. However, when we explore this, and Kennedy also had another quote about the Berlin Wall. Wasn't sure if it was made in a speech or in like an article or an interview, but he said a wall is better than a war, because there were actually positive outcomes for US and the Soviet Union of the Berlin Wall being built. Right, let's go through then to the what exam questions could you get. We'll talk about the narrative question you could get about Berlin towards the end of this lesson. You could get in 2019. They asked explain the importance of the refugee problem in Berlin for, I think it was relations between East and West. With this, you've just got to think what happens really, and apply it to that. So if you think with the refugee problem, where it led to the Berlin ultimatum and the summit meetings, that would be my first paragraph. And then I'd also say that it led to the construction of the Berlin Wall, and I'd talk about the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie, which lasted 18 hours. Okay. They did ask a question as well, like the importance of the Berlin ultimatum. Well, what you just do with that is you just then write about the summit meetings and the Berlin Wall being built. And that's why it's really important. You know what comes afterwards, because if you're explaining why something's important, or the explain one consequence question, which is the first question in the Cold War paper, it's really good to know what happens as a result of it. And that's going to be reasons for why it's important. And then if you've got the question, explain the importance of the building the Berlin Wall. If it was just for increasing tension, you'd have to focus it on just the negative parts. But if it's just for relationships, I think you could do a paragraph about the positive impacts and a paragraph about the negative ones. So the positive one, wars avoided. They don't go to war over Berlin, do they? Khrushchev, after this, essentially accepts that West Berlin is now part of West Germany. It's a shift in their policy. And we don't really, the next time we look at Berlin is actually in 1989 when the Berlin Wall comes down at the end of Key Topic 3. So it'd been tension, hadn't it? From World War II, 48, 49, there was the Berlin crisis with the blockade. You've got late 50s and early 1960s with the building of the Berlin Wall. It does stop Berlin becoming a flashpoint, like an area of tension in the Cold War. So yeah, I would do it as a paragraph about positive, and then I'd also do it as a paragraph about negative. And I think that's a great sentence there. The wall symbolised the failure of diplomacy. So diplomacy is countries and negotiating. Essentially, diplomacy is settling something through negotiation and discussion. They couldn't do that, could they? And the fact that the wall had to be built showed the divide and the difference between the USA and the Soviet Union. They couldn't come together on it. There's the impact on the families and communities as well. But again, it's another thing that symbolises the difference and the division between East and West. And it remains in place for a long time, doesn't it? It comes down in 1989. 1961 to 1989. It's a long period of time. As I said at the start of the video, these plans for the explain the importance questions excuse me, are in the comments. So if you click on the Google Doc link, you can find it on there. Right, the second crisis in Key Topic 2 is looking at Cuba. So one thing that's very important that you know is that Cuba is 90 miles away from mainland USA. There's a bit of Florida that kind of comes down here called the Florida Keys. So 90 miles. So it's very close. It's on America's doorstep, isn't it? And what happens is in 1959, there's a revolution, Cuban revolution, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. So Che Guevara is actually a revolutionary kind of communist guerrilla fighter who went to different countries and fought and helped have revolutions, overthrowing those in power. He was an Argentinian. I'm not sure if he was a doctor. Or he was training to be a doctor, but he wrote a famous book as he was traveling around Argentina called like the Motorcycle Diaries, where he saw issues in Argentinian society and how deeply unfair it was. But one thing that's important about it is that Cuba, it's 90 miles away. Before the revolution, Cuba and America had a very close relationship, and a lot of American businesses had invested in Cuba. A lot of land as well was owned by foreign nationals in Cuba, a lot of those being American. So yeah, this PowerPoint slide here shows you the relationship that Cuba and America had before. And in a lot of cases as well, like Cuba was a bit like a playground for America's rich. Like you'd go there, smoke cigars. There was also lots of things like casinos, prostitution as well was quite high in Cuba at that time. But yeah, Cuba was very much linked to America through things like trade, through like sugar, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also as well though that land owned by foreign nationals. So Fidel Castro, like when the revolution happens, he doesn't declare straight away that it's a communist revolution, but he's somebody that thinks that Cuba's being exploited by the richest in the country, and he didn't like the the dependence that Cuba had on United States. Okay, so when the revolution happened, USA, they refused to actually recognise the new government. They stopped giving Cuba economic aid, and Castro actually started appointing communists into his government. And what was happening was, as USA and Cuba were kind of drifting further away from each other, Cuba and the Soviet Union were becoming closer together. Okay, so Khrushchev actually agreed to buy Cuban sugar and providing economic aid to Cuba, and also as well, we start to see things that would upset the American government. Cuba began taking land from foreign nationals. So if you're an American business owner, you bought land in Cuba, the Cuban government took that land from you. And what ends up happening was, 61, Eisenhower, he's upset about the land being taken from foreign nationals. He reduces the amount of sugar that USA would buy from Cuba. Essentially, these are economic sanctions. And in 1961, all trade is then cut off with Cuba. There's a trade embargo, we can call it. The United States were trying to sort of punish the Cubans economically using their financial might. But, as it says here, the Soviets were happy to kind of take over that trade relationship the United States had before. Okay, so that's the immediate impact of the Cuban Revolution. For the US president, John F. Kennedy, he doesn't want a communist ally so close to American territory. Okay, remember, it's 90 miles away. And what there was, and the plan actually came about before Kennedy's presidency, there was a CIA plan to train Cuban exiles. And what I mean by this is there are Cubans that left Cuba to seek refuge in America. I'm not sure exactly where in America they went, but they went over to America. These Cuban exiles, what the American government did is they trained them there's actually videos of them learning how to shoot weapons. They trained them to make, and what they wanted to do, they didn't, because America can't just invade Cuba. I mean, they could, but they would look bad in the international community. Okay, so what they did is they trained these Cuban exiles, and they wanted to make it look like a counter-revolution. Ultimately, making it look like it's the Cuban people themselves that are actually trying to overthrow the Fidel Castro regime. And this is what the Bay of Pigs incident is. Okay, they even had American planes involved in it, and they painted the Cuban flag on them to try and disguise them as from the Cuban Air Force. But what the Bay of Pigs incident is where these Cuban exiles, they landed at the Bay of Pigs. There were 1,400 of them in 1961. And it's a complete disaster. It's a complete failure. They don't really have military experience, despite the small amount of training they had from the American government. And Castro had 20,000 soldiers ready and waiting there. It's a huge defeat. And also, it's public humiliation for the United States because it's clear that America are involved in it. Okay, and what we'll see is it leads to stronger relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Castro then declares that the 1959 revolution is a communist one. And Kennedy at this point now, he's thinking, well, right, our relationship with Cuba's now got even worse. He's worried about there being nuclear weapons placed on Cuba. So there's two important questions that you could get asked. They've never asked this one, the importance of the Cuban Revolution. It was an explain, at that time, the first question used to be explain two consequences. In 2019, the question was explain two consequences of the Cuban Revolution. But they've changed it for 2025, where it's going to be explain one consequence. So with this, why is it important? I'd say it led to US-Cuban relations got worse, became strained. Soviet Union-Cuba relations improved. I'd write all about the trade embargo, the USA stopping trading sugar with them. And you could also say in there as well that it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. And my second paragraph, I'd say, well, what happens not long after the Cuban Revolution? Okay, actually, the Cuban Revolution is 59. That top there, that should be 59 rather than 61. It also led to the Bay of Pigs incident I'd write about, which is another reason why it's important. And you could get asked a question as well about explaining the importance of the Bay of Pigs incident. And I'd say with this one, it was a public humiliation for USA, worsened Cold War tensions, looked like the United States were hypocrites. They've been criticising the Soviet Union, like in 1956, for invading Hungary. Well, the United States have done a similar thing here, haven't they? And I know it's not the US Army that's actually done it directly, but it's a similar thing, isn't it? They've tried to essentially take over another country, haven't they, through these Cuban exiles? And then what I would do for the second paragraph is say about how it strengthens Soviet-Cuban relations, and it leads to the Soviet Union, which we'll look at in a minute. They begin supplying arms to Cuba, and this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is what we're going to look at in a minute. And the last thing on there that's worth mentioning is the US had an operation called Operation Mongoose, where the CIA had a series of assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. I think actually from our history, Castro might be one of the people that there's been the most assassination attempts against him. Okay, and then moving on to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So why does the Soviet Union want to put missiles on Cuba? Well, Khrushchev wants to expand communism, doesn't he? And having missiles there would mean that Cuba's going to be more protected in case there's going to be a war. It says there, the second part, look, to close the missile gap, because the United States had missiles based in Turkey, which borders the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev wanted to match how the USA had them there. And finally, Khrushchev wanted to look strong domestically. So he thought that if he can get missiles based on Cuba, his position in the Soviet Union would be strengthened. So Kennedy's got a real dilemma here. What does he do? And his advisors are called, his team advisors are called EXCOM. They came up with options of what to do. They could ignore the missiles. They could get the UN involved, United Nations. Remember, UN was established at Yalta in Key Topic 1. They could blockade Cuba, which means block off any ships coming in, or they could actually do a full-on invasion where they invade Cuba. Okay. The thing with Kennedy is he needed to appear strong. It's always important with this. Like, we're looking at it from the point of view of foreign policy, aren't we? But it's always important to think about for these US presidents and premiers of the Soviet Union, how they're looking domestically, back in their own country politically. That's very important for them, how it reflects on them. So October 1961, an American U-2 spy plane takes pictures of missile launch pads in Cuba. No missiles yet, but the writing's on the wall, really, isn't it? It's quite clear what's going to be happening. And there was intelligence that Soviet ships were actually on their way to Cuba. As I said before, Georgia, Azerbaijan were part of the Soviet Union, and Turkey, NATO, because Turkey were part of NATO in this period. The United States had missiles based in Turkey. And what there was it was a 13-day period, okay, where it looked like war could happen. And it's the closest that nuclear war we've ever come to in the world. In a summary, the US set up a naval blockade called a quarantine, and they were going to search any ships sailing towards Cuba to check that they didn't have any missiles on them. And the real summary is the Soviet ships, they end up reaching the blockade and they do turn round. But what we have here is like a timeline of some of the key events that happened within this. There were some negotiations going on behind the scenes, like, letters between them about deals. Like they were trying to resolve it through diplomatic means, weren't they, before it got to any kind of military conflict. But yeah, so Kennedy, Khrushchev promises to remove the launch sites if the USA agrees to lift the blockade and promises not to invade Cuba. And also Khrushchev says the launch sites be removed if US remove the missiles from Turkey. So Kennedy, he answers the first telegram, really, and privately considers the removal of missiles from Turkey. And as a result of that, Khrushchev agrees to actually remove the missile sites from Cuba. The boats, they turn round. The missiles never actually end up going onto Cuba. And the key thing of this is, it got to the point where nuclear war was on the brink. And the key word from the Cuban Missile Crisis is brinkmanship. They're both willing to go to the brink of war. But there's some really important consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis that are important to know about, which we'll go more through in a minute. But with the negotiations done through like letters and telegrams, they wanted a better communication line, because I don't know if you've had it before, where somebody sent you a message, a text, and you've read it and misunderstood what it says because it's done by text rather than verbally. Well, to avoid there being any miscommunication in the future, a hotline is set up in 1963, a red telephone, which is a direct line between the White House in USA and the Kremlin in the Soviet Union. So the leaders could directly talk to each other. There would be translators as well, I'm sure. Pretty sure Khrushchev wouldn't have been able to speak English. But also as well, when we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we'll come to this in a minute, I often say short-term tension as high as it can be between two countries that don't go to war. But long-term, there is a thaw. And we actually see agreements over certain aspects of the Cold War. So 1963, there's the Test Ban Treaty. They agree not to test nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, the atmosphere. 1967, the Outer Space Treaty. They agree not to use... this is around the time of like Star Wars and James Bond's Moonraker, which were based in space. They agree not to use space for military purposes. That actually, interestingly, would have been broken in 1983 in Key Topic 3 with Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiatives, where they were going to put these satellites into space. I'll talk about that in the Key Topic 3 video. And they also in 1968 agreed to try to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What that essentially means was countries that don't have nuclear weapons, they don't want them to get them, and they feel that the world's going to be a safer place if the less countries have it, the better. So we also see as well the nuclear missiles are taken out of Turkey, and they start to talk about, which is what we'll look at in Key Topic 2, it paves the way for Détente and SALT I, which takes place, which is actually signed in the early 1972. SALT I is signed. So, if you've got a question about the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's a lot to write about. I think this would be a really good question to have. I'll do it as 2 paragraphs. Firstly, as I said before, short-term negative, brinkmanship, as big a crisis you can come to where it looked like the sides would go to war. Importantly as well with this, I haven't mentioned this yet, but Khrushchev was in the Soviet Union. It was seen that like Khrushchev backed down first. He came across as the one domestically that was weak and humiliated. But what I would also say as well, second paragraph, this is where you write about long-term positive. Remember with the question, you've got to, if it says the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis for increasing tension between US and the Soviet Union, you've just got to write about the negative aspects. But if it's just relationship, that's both. You can write about positive and negative, because it does lead to positive things, as I said before. The hotline, the limited test ban treaty, the outer space treaty, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Okay, and it says at the bottom there, a shift towards diplomacy and mutual restraint, showing that they'd learned from, I think this can be slightly cut off there, it showed they'd learned from the dangers of the crisis. They kind of realised, well, the war could have happened here, we were on the brink. Let's make sure we make the world a safer place going forward. Now, the last part of Key Topic 3 is looking at Czechoslovakia in 1968. Just like the Berlin Wall crisis we looked at then, late 50s to early 60s, could be mixed up with the Berlin crisis from 1948 to 49, the Berlin blockade. Czechoslovakia in 68 could be easily mixed up with Hungary in 1956. They're both examples of satellite states where there's protests and unrest. There's both examples where there's a change in leadership, and they're both examples where they are actually invaded. But you do need to know the difference between them, because if you're writing about Hungary and you end up writing about Czechoslovakia, you probably actually still get a few marks because you're going to be saying similar things. However, if you're writing about names of the leaders, they're going to be wrong, aren't they? So it's important you know the difference between them. So Czechoslovakia, it had become a communist state and a satellite state in 1948. Like Stalin had supported the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia taking power there. And life in, that should really say the people of Czechoslovakia, because it's Czechoslovakia until the 1990s when it splits then into Czech Republic and Slovakia. So apologies for that. But life for the people of Czechoslovakia under the Soviet government was quite poor. There was a lack of consumer goods. There were shortages of essential goods. There was a secret police, like in Hungary. Also, as well, there was really strict censorship, and it was a one-party state as well. There was very limited democracy. There was no, you weren't allowed to be an opposition group. You weren't allowed to oppose the Communist Party in power. So we've got here what caused the Prague Spring. A lot of the things we mentioned there were the lack of personal freedom. People in Czechoslovakia as well might have thought, well, USA could potentially support us here. And also as well, the Czech economy was quite weak. They were bitter that the Soviet Union was controlling the economy and using it for their benefit. Okay, so examples of that: Czech farmers had to follow guidance on what to produce, and if they tried to modernize farming, it was discouraged. Okay, so all these things led to kind of the communist government in Czechoslovakia not being popular, but we end up, just like in Hungary, having a new leader in Czechoslovakia. So Alexander Dubček ends up becoming the head of the Czech government. Okay, so the Soviet Union, they initially approve of it. They feel that he could make it more effective and less unpopular. There'd be less unrest in Czechoslovakia. And he was a committed Warsaw Pact sort of advocate and a devoted communist, but he was what we'd call more of a liberal communist. What I mean by this was he still was a communist, but he wanted communism to have a few more freedoms. Okay, and one thing that a quote about him is that he believed in socialism with a human face. Okay, essentially, I think of socialism as a similar word to communism. Okay, and with that, it's essentially saying, look, I still want to have communism, socialism, but I want there to be more freedom, to have a human face, and be a little bit more personable. Okay, so what Dubček does, and it's important to understand this, with the satellite states of the Soviet Union, there were certain rules for how they should be governed. Okay, one-party state, no travel to the west, or very limited travel to the west, heavy censorship, no non-communists to be included in the government. Trade unions have limited power, okay, and also as well a highly kind of controlled economy where the government controls the means of production, things like factories, okay. So what Dubček does is he introduces something called the Prague Spring, okay, and it was named that. We're in spring at the moment. It's lovely weather. It feels good, doesn't it? Like the flowers are starting to blossom. And it's called that because Prague's the capital of Czechoslovakia, and spring because of that optimistic atmosphere. Okay, so people in Czechoslovakia, they start to feel, well, hang on a minute, maybe life could improve. So what was the Prague Spring? These were Dubček's reforms. He relaxes censorship. Trade unions get more power. Trade with the West increased, which was discouraged. Satellite states were kind of discouraged or not allowed to trade with the West. And generally, Czech people had greater freedoms. Okay, so we have Leonid Brezhnev. Okay, you'll always remember his eyebrows if you can't quite remember his name. He's the leader of the Soviet Union. Whilst the Czech people were kind of quite pleased about these reforms, remember it's known as the Prague Spring, Brezhnev is worried. He disapproved of them. And one thing he'd be worried about is he'd be thinking, well, hang on a minute, if Czechoslovakia introduced these liberal reforms, like less censorship, Poland might as well, Hungary might, Romania might, Bulgaria might, and then if they're all, and with less censorship, newspapers might be able to criticise communism. That might lead to the whole of this Eastern Bloc, we call it, the satellite states, falling and not longer being communist anymore. Okay, and it might even spread into the Soviet Union. This is kind of what happens at the end of the Cold War. So Brezhnev, although I obviously disagree completely with what he did with Czechoslovakia, you can kind of understand his thinking that he was worried about communism being endangered. So Brezhnev urged Dubček, don't endanger communism. And Dubček, he actually invited Yugoslav leader Tito. So Tito was actually a communist as well, but he wasn't in the... They didn't have very good links and a good relationship with the Soviet Union. So it's essentially like he's invited a leader that Brezhnev wouldn't get on with, Tito, over to Czechoslovakia to have talks with. Also Romania as well. If you remember, after the Hungarian uprising, like the Romania kind of cut ties with Moscow, they came over. So Brezhnev was worried about these states coming together and potentially forming some kind of rival to what he's creating. So what do? Like in Hungary, there's the invasion. 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invade Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring is ended. You can see here the invasion took place from the bordering Warsaw Pact states and the Soviet Union as well. Little opposition to the invasion, so that's one difference between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Like in Czechoslovakia, they didn't announce they leave the Warsaw Pact like they did in Hungary. In Hungary as well, it's a lot more violent. A lot more people die. There isn't much opposition in Czechoslovakia. But just like in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, Dubček is arrested and dismissed from office. Dubček isn't executed like Imre Nagy was in Hungary. But like in Hungary, where János Kadar replaced Imre Nagy, Gustav Husak replaced Dubček. And you can see straight away, like when I'm saying those names, I'm just like thinking, oh yeah, am I saying the right one again? It's quite important. You've got to know the difference between them. Like, so yeah, and then we then have like a loyal, hardline communist again in charge of Czechoslovakia. Okay, and a really important thing that comes as a result of this is the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, and this would remain in place from 1968 right up until the end of the Cold War, when it's dropped by Mikhail Gorbachev. Essentially, what the Brezhnev Doctrine stated was that it was the duty of all communist states, all Warsaw Pact members, to intervene if it looked like communism would be threatened. So it really set the tone for future Eastern European countries that they weren't going to be allowed to introduce any liberal reforms like they did in Czechoslovakia. Okay, there's a little bit more about that if you want to pause it and read through it. What are the consequences, though? So it's important consequences there for Czechoslovakia, Soviet and US relations, and Western Europe communist countries as well. So for Czechoslovakia, for many, it's devastating. There's a Czech student, Jan Palek, and if you go to one of the main squares in Prague, Wenceslas Square, you can actually see this memorial to him, which is a cross in the ground. Jan Palek decided to set fire to himself as a form of protest against the Communist Party and what had happened over Czechoslovakia. Okay. We also see as well Soviet-US relations. They are temporarily worsened again, just like they were over Hungary as well. And what's important with this is that the US is in the middle of a presidential election when it took place. They're kind of preoccupied with that, with what's going on domestically, but also as well the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War we don't mention in our course. The reason why is because it's part of a paper 3 topic. You can do USA and you look at the Vietnam War as part of that. So America, just like Hungary, condemned the invasion but didn't offer military support. And what did this mean for Western Europe? Well, Western Europe, again, like America, condemned the invasion, but no military support was offered. And what you had is there were communist parties in Western Europe, like in Italy and France. Those communist parties actually cut ties with the Soviet Union. They were outraged with actually what course of action the Soviet Union had decided to make. And they started to develop their own form of communism called Euro-communism. So there's a real split in communist in what's happened in the future for communism, and really importantly for the communist countries, we see that it shows that they can't leave the Warsaw Pact, they can't introduce liberal reforms, but interestingly, it increased the rivalry between China, who's a communist country as well, and the Soviet Union. So China criticised the use of force. They were worried that the Soviet Union could one day invade them, and we spoke before about some of those other communist countries in Europe. But communist countries began to move away from Moscow. So President of Romania refused to send troops to invade Czechoslovakia. And Albania did the same as them, and they actually left the Warsaw Pact in 1968. Yugoslavia condemned the invasion. And so there's a real fallout from this invasion that takes place. Okay, so the last bit from this is just if you've got a question about why is the importance of the events in Czechoslovakia, like why is it important for relations or the Cold War, you could get asked a question as well about the Brezhnev Doctrine, why that's important. You can just see it on here. I've kind of covered all of this already, but if you want to pause it and have a look through it, as I said before, all these kind of little plans for the importance questions are in the in the Google document in the comments below. Okay, for this question, for the explain one consequence question, if you wanted to go through and pause this and just learn, if you had explain one consequence, what would be a good one to write about? One thing that's worth knowing is, in 2019, they asked the question, explain two consequences. At that point, it was two consequences rather than one consequence. One consequence of the Cuban Revolution. They didn't reward the Cuban Missile Crisis, because with this question, it's important to have something that comes in the immediate aftermath of this. Okay, so if you can do that one, I'd write about the trade embargo. Could be a good one to write about within there. Okay, and then there's been 3 narrative questions about the Cold War crisis, so one of these could come up again. What you got to do with this one is just think about what's the start point, what comes next, what comes after that, and what comes at the end, and then you've got to explain that sequence of events. Key Topic 1 video, which you can see on my channel, that has a lot of techniques-based stuff on the narrative question, how to answer it. So if it was this one, the crisis over Berlin, what you do is start with the refugee problem. You'd then write about the Berlin Ultimatum. You'd then write about the summit meetings. You'd then write about the building of the Berlin Wall and the impact of that. Okay? And you can see that would actually be on the specification. Let's go back to the specification for Key Topic 2, just over. You can see refugee problem, you'd start with Berlin Ultimatum, summit meetings, construction of the wall, and then the impact of it. Okay, and the key thing with the narrative question is you explain the sequence of events. You see, it's like you go from like the Berlin Ultimatum, how that led to the summit meetings over Berlin. Okay. We then have the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you had the events of that, I would do the Cuban Revolution. I would do the how that led to the relations becoming worse between them. The Bay of Pigs incident. Okay. Then you go actually into the missile sites being photographed, and then you go into the events of it. Like the television address I haven't actually mentioned today, but that I think it's on one of the slides previous to this, where Kennedy essentially spoke to the US population, telling them about the situation in Cuba and that they were going to have the naval quarantine. Yeah, then I'd end with the consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, things like I would end with it. Like the hotline being established and the thaw that we saw following that. And then the final one, key event, analysing the events of the Prague Spring. I'll probably in there write about how they first became, very briefly, it first became a communist state. Then I'll talk about the situation in Czechoslovakia, Dubček becoming the new leader, socialism with a human face. I'll then do the reaction by Brezhnev and the Warsaw Pact invasion. You'd then go into like the impact of that. You could talk about the communist countries and parties across Europe cutting ties with them. You could talk as well about the American, the international reaction to it. Okay, right. So I hope today's session's been useful for you. As I've got in the comments as well, I do offer private tutoring for students that aren't at the school that I teach at. So if you're a student from my school, I'm your teacher. But if you are from a school that isn't the school I teach at, my email address is in the comments. So I hope today was useful, and good luck with your revision.